Hi, I'm Mike Hudson. I'm the director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind in Louisville, Kentucky, and welcome to the museum. So we're going to do a short walkthrough and just kind of give you some of the highlights of the museum. When you start at the museum, you're faced with these reproductions of all this early writing forms, Egyptian hieroglyphics and Incan and Mayan carvings, some stuff from the Greeks, and even Sumerian cuneiform from the Middle East. And strangely enough, all of these writing styles, what do they have in common? They're all tactile, right? So if the Pharaoh or the God King or the city-state of Athens or King Hammurabi in ancient Sumeria had wanted to teach his blind subjects how to read and write, they already had that technology. But of course, no one thought to teach people who were blind to read. Most blind people were beggars. And it was only really in the late 18th century that that started to change. We're going to kind of walk you through some of those changes. So let's go into the museum. So first, a little background on the building here at APH. Of course, you can still come to the American Printing House and go on a factory tour. When you come to the museum, though, you're in some of the oldest spaces here in the museum. We have two galleries, and this gallery is in the original 1883 building, and you can see it's got these cast iron columns, and the old gas light fixtures are still visible, old fire doors. There's a lot of evidence of the way this building was used originally as a manufacturing structure. And this exhibit, as you walk around, takes you decade by decade through the history of the printing house. But let's go back a little further than that and look at the very first books for blind readers. So this is a copy of Valentine Auoui's essay on education of the blind, or in French, the Essai. This is the first book that was ever embossed in raised letters for blind readers. And Auoui had founded the first school for kids that were blind in 1784 in Paris, France. He had one student, a young man named Francois Lesueur. And Lesueur, one of his jobs at the school was to go pick up the mail. And every now and then he would notice that Dr. Auoui would get a fancy embossed invitation to some event that he could feel with his fingers. And so he and Auoui got together and developed a font of raised letters. They had special type cast, and that's what this book was made. And so it was like a eureka moment for blind people everywhere, the first book that they could read with their fingers. Now, at Dr. Auoui's school, in around 1819, 1820, a young man named Louis Braille shows up. And Louis had lost his vision in an accident in his father's shop, but he was very inquisitive, very brilliant little fellow. And while he was at the School for the Blind there in Paris, France, he was exposed to a dot system that had been invented by another French fellow named Charles Barbier. And Barbier had invented this code based on dots. He didn't know how it was going to be used. He thought it might be useful for blind people, and so he had sent it over to the school there in Paris, and little Louis, 12 years old, got to see it, and he loved it. And Barbier's code was a little bit clunky and complicated. Louis simplified it down to the 6 dots of the Braille cell that we use today, and in 1829 he published his work in this book, which is called the Procédé. It's the method for reading and writing by means of dots. And so down there you can see that below the raised letter version of the A, B, C, and D are Louis's dot code. And we still use the exact, in English, or at least in European Braille, we still use the exact same code. Now we've added some ideas like contractions, and those are symbols that stand for more than one letter of the alphabet. But literally, Louis' code from 1829 is still the code we use today. This is one of the most rare books here in our collection. There are only 6 copies of this book left anywhere in the world that we know of, and so it's really a highlight of any visit to the American Printing House for the Blind. Now we have a lot of other early tactile books. Books from Great Britain, the first book from the United States. And this is our first book from the American Printing House for the Blind. This was done in 1869. This was from an English children's book writer named John Gay, Stories and Fables by John Gay. And it was in raised letters. It wouldn't be for another 30 years or so that we would start making books in Braille. Now let's look at some of the early equipment that we have on display here in the museum. So this is an early stereograph machine. This machine was used to make metal plates, hinged metal plates that went into a printing press to mass produce dot codes. Now this one wasn't actually made for Braille. In the United States, really from about 1868 or so until about the 1920s, there was a big debate over which tactile code to use. There were some advocates for the raised letters, like Dr. Awee's books had been made in, and like our first book here at the Printing House was made in raised letters. Then there was a guy named William Waite. This is a picture of him back here. He worked in a school in New York, and he had come up with an alternative dot code that he called New York Point. And then there were some people who were a big fan of Louis Braille's Braille system. So you have some schools were teaching one, some the other, and they would get together in meetings and have big knockdown, drag-out fights over which system to use. And so when the Printing House first started making books in dots, they were using William Waite's New York Point system, and this was the machine that was used to create the embossing plates for that. Now there have been lots of ways that inventors have come up with to try and make it possible for people who are blind or visually impaired to write. Here's a good example from Austria. This is a pen type case, and it was invented by an Austrian fellow named Johann Wilhelm Klein sometime around 1805, 1806, something like that. And each one of these little types has pins at the bottom, like a needle. And they are arranged in the shape of a letter. And when you pierce a piece of paper with those pins, you get the shape of the letter in little holes that you can feel with your fingers. This case here is filled with just various varieties of Braille slates. Lots of different Braille slates. And a Braille slate is kind of like a handwriting tool for making Braille. And as you can see by the case, lots of different examples. I'm going to show you how to do it though. So you're going to take your piece of paper, raise the frame on the slate, put our paper in, and then we close the frame. Now you'll see that there are little windows, right? And those guide the placement of your stylus to write your Braille. So my name's Mike, right? So I'm going to start writing my M and my I and my K and my E. Now you'll notice that I am not writing from left to right like one might do with a pencil and paper. I'm writing from right to left because I'm pressing the dots into the paper so that when I pull the paper out, I can't feel those dots because they're down. The stylus has poked them down. I'm going to turn it over, and there's my name, M-I-K-E, right? So it reads correctly. So when we write with a stylus, we actually write as if we're looking in a mirror. We write from right to left, and we reverse all the symbols. And a lot of sighted people, when they hear me explain this for the first time, they go, "Oh, that sounds really complicated." But actually, it's not that bad. But there was an American guy who looked at these Braille slates back in the late 19th century and said, "Can't we do something faster than that? Or can we mechanize that process?" Let's look at that. So this is our display of Braille Writers. basically Braille typewriters. And we have dozens on display here in this display. We also have more than 40 different designs from all over the world that have been invented over time. But the machine that I'm talking about was invented by this fellow right here. This is Frank Hall. He was the principal teacher at the Illinois School for the Blind, and this is his machine. This is the Hall Braille Writer. And he came up with this machine in about 1892. And notice it has 6 dots and a space bar. So the 6 keys make the letters of the alphabet, and punctuation marks and numbers, and all you need is 6 keys. Each key controls 1 dot in that 6-dot Braille cell. And his machine was copied. It's been adapted. This is the Perkins Braille Writer, and it's the most popular Braille writer still used all around the world. It is not a new machine. It was invented in 1951, but despite lots of inventors trying to come up with a better machine, it's still the champion. So that's writing Braille, but there are a lot of other subjects that kids have to learn in school. And so our collection here in our museum talks about a lot of other subjects. We're going to walk just around behind you here, and we're going to look at some early maps. So geography is obviously a subject that a lot of kids struggle with, but it's a very visual subject when you're studying maps. And so what we have done over time, and many other developers have come up with tactile maps. And we have a lot of those in our collection. This is one of my favorites. This is an old wooden map of South America. It's a puzzle map, so each individual country is there, but these maps were individually carved by hand. So each piece had to be individually carved by hand, and so as you can imagine, you couldn't mass produce these kinds of maps. But later on, we do start mass producing maps. This is a relief globe of the United States, and it has all of the continents. And the mountains are there in kind of exaggerated relief. If you actually held the earth in your hands, it wouldn't feel as bumpy as this map does, but we exaggerate the relief. We make the relief bigger than it really needs to be so that it's very easy to find the various mountain chains and the lakes. I'm in Africa right now, and so it's very easy to feel the various parts of that. But this map was made in a mold. So the mold is actually in our collection, and so it was made out of epoxy material, and you would fill the mold with plastic, and you could make as many of these maps as you wanted to. But then it was the surface of it's all been hand painted. We've also done smaller globes, but again, it's a relief globe, so the mountains and the valleys and the larger lakes. And then of course you can see the latitude and longitude lines that geographers use to assign precise locations. And then the equator is there in a very exaggerated raised line around the middle. So all you're doing with all of these sorts of things is just adapting a classroom tool that is used in all kinds of classrooms around the world and just make it accessible to kids that were blind or visually impaired. And they've done a lot of work with maps over time. Let's look at math. So what we have in this case is lots of different math tools that have been adapted for kids who are blind or visually impaired. The abacus is a simple one. All we've done here with this abacus is put a felt backing on it, and that way the beads, if you were to set a problem up or something, and then you drop this on the ground, the felt keeps the beads from moving around. So that's the only change between it and lots of different Asian styles of abacuses, and we have a very large collection of abacuses. And then we also have what you would call arithmetic slates, and you can see several designs there. In one case, the red and yellow one, those just have Braille characters on them, and so you use the grids to set up your math problem in a column the same way that a kid with a pencil or paper might do it. And these other slates are kind of similar things, only instead of using Braille, they use unique symbols on the surface of little metal types, and you set them down into the holes, and then when you turn them one position in these, this is a pentagonal hole, and then this one is an octagonal hole. Depending on how the type is arranged in the hole, it means something different. So you don't need very many shapes of types to represent all the letters and operators, plus, minus, and parentheses and things that we use to set up math problems. Now, we also have a lot of games. People who are blind or visually impaired love enjoying games. We have a lot of games in our collection. This is a brand new one called the Game of Squares, and it's got several games in it, but what we've got set up here is tic-tac-toe. So it just uses Velcro, and you know, the players have X's and O's, and they, you know, set up their game, and if you get 3 in a row, you get tic-tac-toe. But it's all done in a tangible, a tactile format, right? But we also have lots of playing cards and dominoes and chess sets, all sorts of games, and just slightly adapted so that people who are blind or visually impaired can enjoy them. Let's walk back here and let's look at something that the printing house has been doing since the 1930s, making audiobooks, only we call them talking books. So APH started making talking books back in 1936. And back then the recording was done on a machine called a record lathe. And that's what you're looking at here is a record lathe. So in a soundproof booth, a narrator would speak into a microphone. That microphone would go into a bank of electronics that then was connected to this machine. And this machine would heat up a needle. And so where you see it says Westrec 2B recorder, that's a very special recording head. It would heat up a needle and it would cut a groove into a blank acetate disc. That black disc was made out of an early plastic called acetate. And that is actually making the recording. And you would take that disc, take it to a very dirty part of our operation, and you would make these stamping plates. These metal discs are stamping plates. And if you can see this photograph, I'm not sure how well that's coming through in the video, but you can see a record press, and there in the open jaws of the press, you can see those stamping discs where they've been put in there. You would put in some black vinyl, close the press. The press would be pumped full of steam, and that would melt the black vinyl, and out comes, and you can see the operator there from about 1938 or so, pulling a rigid vinyl record album. And then we would, if you were recording a book like Gulliver's Travels, it might come on 8, 10, or even 16 discs to make up the entire book. Those would go into a shipping container, and they would be shipped to libraries all around the country, and that's where you would get your book. And then you also had to have players, right, for those discs. So here we have a couple of early examples. This is a wind-up phonograph from the mid-1930s. You can see it has a crank over here. So it had a spring on the inside, just like you would wind your watch, only you would wind up the phonograph. When you turned it on, the turntable would turn. It didn't have a speaker on it, so only one person could listen. You can see there's a pair of headphones back there. You would plug your headphones in, and one person would wear the headphones and they could listen to the record at a time. Now, if you had electricity, then you might have a more advanced machine like this. This is from the 1950s. In this case, it's you plug it in, you put the tone arm on your record, and it had a speaker in the lid. And so, everybody, within listening distance of that phonograph could listen to it. Now, of course, later on, we started experimenting with other kinds of technologies like cassettes. There's a little cassette player back there. In the 1970s, we started switching over from making audiobooks on records, rigid vinyl, and started making them on cassettes. We also used a bunch of other experimental machines, which you can kind of see over here. Sony made a really nice reel-to-reel recorder and player, and so we experimented at times with using reel-to-reel tape. And then this little machine down here is kind of cool. This is a sound scriber. You could connect a microphone to a sound scriber in your own home or office and literally dictate a letter or anything you wanted to say, and it would record it on little flexible discs. And you could either play that disc back yourself on at home, or you could put it in an envelope and mail it to somebody, and if they had another Stereograph machine, then they could listen to your letter. And so for people who are blind or visually impaired, this was just another early recording technology. Of course, today, everybody has a really great high quality digital recorder in their pocket if they've got a cell phone. And so a lot of this technology, fairly big and fairly bulky, has been replaced, certainly in the West, by the cell phone. Now let's talk a little bit about large print. So initially, APH was created to make books for people who had no usable vision. And so they were using tactile formats like we talked about, raised letters or Braille. But in the 1940s, we started making large print books. It had been known for a long time that there were a lot of people out there who had enough usable vision left that if you just made the print, the type in the book big enough, then it was easier for them to read. We have some examples of that here. And in the display case is one of the embossing or the printing plates from one of our early large print books. And so we still make millions of pages of large print every year. And then there's this little machine. This is the Opticon. It had the little camera, and you would take your camera and you would put it on top of, you would open any regular print book, put your camera on the top, and then you put your finger down there, and the Opticon would raise these little metal pins into the shapes of the letters that were underneath your camera. So my phone is going off. That tells me we've been talking to you for about 20 minutes, and I didn't want to make this too long. So as you can see, your trip to the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind, we could talk to you about hundreds of years of advances for special materials made for kids who are blind or visually impaired to help them learn how to read, to be literate, to get good jobs, and to participate in ordinary life. And that's what we do here at the Printing House, and we look forward to the time when you can come join us for a live tour.